Before getting into the 14th century Italian Renaissance, we need to deal with Renaissance humanism. Now, Renaissance humanism is a revival in the study of classical antiquity. At first in Italy and then spreading across Western Europe in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. This is not modern secular humanism, nor is it a philosophy. And please do not confuse this with secularism, which is a wholly different idea. Humanism was a pervasive cultural mode and not the program of a small elite. Rather, it's a program to revive the cultural legacy, literary legacy, and moral philosophy of classical antiquity. And we see a return to many of the Greek and Roman ideals, mostly civic and philosophical, not a return to paganism or secularism, more a reconciliation of these classical ideas with the church. Where are these ideas coming from? They aren't digging up manuscripts. What's actually happening is we're going to see that Islam will be slowly conquered in Spain. And there's one city at the center of this, which is Granada. Granada has massive libraries and a great deal of information, books that Islam has translated into Arabic, starting with materials that they got from the Byzantine Empire, some of which were holdovers from ancient Rome. They translate this, they end up in Granada, they end up in Baghdad, or copies end up in Baghdad. And so as Christianity reconquers Spain and completes the reconquest in 1492, which is going to be important later, but after 1492, they've reconquered all of Spain, which means all of the manuscripts from Granada will be sent to Paris and to Italy, the two centers of learning where we see them translated back into French and Italian and therefore becoming accessible to the general public. Now, we have other people who are going to play a role here, such as Petrarch. And he comes from Tuscany, and he's a devoted classical scholar who's considered the father of humanism, a philosophy that helped spark the Renaissance. Petrarch in his own time was primarily known for his work in discovering and disseminating classical literature, as well as his work in Latin and his imitation of classical literature, such as his letters. He was famous for discovering several texts by Cicero, including letters and verifying that they were actually written by Cicero. This activity of rediscovering ancient texts, again, those coming primarily from the Islamic world, became the hallmark of humanism throughout the 14th and most of the 15th century. Although Petrarch collected Greek texts, he didn't seem to have read them. So he focuses on rediscovering classical literature, rested firmly on Latin literature. So he's focusing on Roman literature. Of course, the Romans had translated much of Greek literature into their own. And so he can do that. And he's getting it from Islam. He's also getting it from the Byzantine Empire, which still in some way exists up until 1453. So let's talk about humanism itself. Humanism is ultimately a way of looking at the world. It's a code of conduct, educational theory, and scholarly discipline more than a philosophy. It kind of shapes the entire world in which one lives. So let's start with the educational theory. The humanists believed that students had to master both Latin and Greek, as well as acquire a thorough grounding in the works of Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle. Cicero, a great orator of ancient Rome, Plato and Aristotle, great philosophers of ancient Greece. This would become the model of Renaissance education in the century to follow. They focus on ideas such as eloquence or rhetoric, the ability for a man to persuade a crowd. And they have certain ideals that they focus on. And these ideals apply to everyone, not just in education. For example, self-sacrifice for the state. Well, we do the same thing today. Participation in government. We vote. They would have held large public debates as well as public votes. The defense of state institutions, in their case, even against the church. Because at the time, the church has developed something called the papal states. They have actual territory that they're trying to conquer. The church is also seen as corrupt in this time. We also see a stoic indifference to personal hardship, this sort of idea of the stiff upper lip. Someone accepting hardship and simply moving through it, and that being a great positive when looking at their personality. We also see an emphasis on individual contributions, as well as creativity and fame. This is where the cult of fame sort of ideas come from. It actually starts with the Greeks and then gets transferred along with that Greek and Roman knowledge into Renaissance Italy and throughout the Renaissance. And here they're reflecting these ideas in Renaissance art. Things like focusing on human potential, rationality, and achievement. The idea is that God gave free will. God gave rational thought, and therefore we need to do everything we can to develop those ideas, to develop those skills. Artists will start to take credit for their work. Before this, they had been primarily artisans and craftsmen, sort of like plumbers. They will start to portray known individuals, and they're going to do this in the time that those people live, or very shortly thereafter. Frequently in the form of sculptures of artists and authors, in this case of Dante. We also see a return to classical forms in art, Greek and Roman forms in art, with a redevelopment of realism based on observations of the human body, models, as we'll see later, dissection. So they're actually going to look at the human form as opposed to sitting there going, well, I know a human has a head and 2 hands and 2 feet and a whole bunch of cloth in between. They're actually going to start looking at the human form. That sense of naturalism, that sense of realism is going to be really incredibly important throughout the Renaissance.